All right, so the certificate in Israel education. On October 7th, 2023, our world changed as we know it. Israel was attacked, and we felt the ramifications of the war all over the world. Our students here in Miami felt it also, as they had siblings in Israel at the time, either on a gap year or serving in the army. They had family members called back to reserves, or also some of their teachers were called back for service. As our students, educators, and administrators were grappling for ways to cope and frankly just overwhelmed, CAJE decided to create a community of practice made up of teachers who teach Israel in Jewish day schools and offer support and guidance with the help of a consultant, Dr. Jonathan Golden. So as you can see, students were confused, educators were overwhelmed, and the community of practice provided shared learning, emotional support, expert guidance, and collaboration. We found that teachers want to bring greater complexity and honesty into their classrooms in Israel teaching, but many feel unable to do so because of potential backlash from administrators, parents, or the broader community. And they told us this directly. One particularly telling example involved two teachers from one of our schools, both who are visibly frum, observant, and strongly Zionist. As part of an educational exercise, they chose to role play a debate, one taking a Zionist position and the other arguing from a Palestinian perspective. Their intention was purely pedagogical, to model critical thinking, explore multiple narratives, and help students engage meaningfully with challenging topics. However, once students shared what they saw at home, parents' reactions escalated quickly, even though both teachers were clearly observant and Zionists. This leads me to Dr. Keren Fraiman and her award-winning research in this field. In her chapter, Barriers to Entry, Educator Reticence for Engaging with the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, from the book Teaching Israel, Studies of Pedagogy from the Field, Dr. Fraiman explains exactly what our teachers from the community of practice expressed by identifying four main barriers. One of them is knowledge. Teachers feel they don't know enough to handle the hard questions. The other is pedagogy. They are afraid of losing control of the classroom. As you know, Israel conversations can escalate very quickly. Emotional intensity. Both teachers and students carry personal and communal pain around Israel into the classroom. And the fourth is communal pressures. Backlash from their community, lack of institutional support, and of course, harsh parent reactions. Enter the certificate in Israel education. We need to make a change, and the change cannot start in the classroom with the educators. It needs to stem from the top down. It needs to be systemic. Educators will not engage in complex and honest Israel education if they don't feel supported. By first educating the heads of school, the board chairs, and the lay people, we are ensuring there is a safe space for teachers to engage in these conversations. We are creating communal buy-in so that everyone is on board with the school's approach. We are making sure that Israel education is consistent across all grades and departments, and we are empowering our school leadership, our heads of schools and board chairs to stand behind their teachers when those difficult conversations come up. So why is this certificate in Israel education so important in this post-October 7th world? So this is where I'm going to take a little break, and I'm going to ask Helen Chassett to please read this slide if you can.
Yes, am I on mute or no? No, I'm okay.
No, you're good.
All right. Okay, the whole slide. Here we go.
The whole slide.
Okay, this is again from the chapter that Dr. Fraiman wrote. And I think you already read the title of the book. Preparing our students for the Israel conversations they will encounter once they leave our classrooms. Students who were raised with only the sunshine story of Israel report feeling betrayed or blindsided when encountering the full complexity of Israel's realities for the first time outside of day school. Students who are only taught one side often face a crisis of identity when exposed to more complex or critical narratives. Some disengage entirely from Israel and their Jewish identity as a result. The hard truth is, protecting our students by withholding complexity does not make them stronger advocates for Israel. It makes them more vulnerable.
Thank you. So I think this slide is pretty self-explanatory. So I'm going to ask now, Marian, if you can, please.
Sure. Dr.
Thank you.
Fraiman found that students who were exposed to both the inspiring and the challenging aspects of Israel's history, politics, and society actually developed a stronger, more resilient connection to Israel. They were more emotionally equipped to handle criticism. They felt more authentic in their love for Israel because they were not afraid to engage with its complexities. They reported higher levels of confidence in advocating for Israel. Nuance strengthened identity. Complexity deepens love.
Thank you. So most of us understand that the blind love phase, the stage where someone seems perfect, is only the beginning of any deep relationship. Whether with a spouse, a parent, a mentor, or a close friend, we eventually move past that idealized view. As the relationship matures, we begin to see the person more fully, with complexity, nuance, strengths, and imperfections. And in most cases, the deeper understanding leads to a more resilient and more honest and more enduring love. Our relationship with Israel is no different. Many of us grew up in that early romantic stage, loving Israel wholeheartedly, uncritically, and often without grappling with the complexities that come with any real place, real people, and real history. But as we grow, ask questions, learn more, and confront the difficult moments alongside the inspiring ones, our love doesn't diminish. It matures. It becomes sturdier, deeper, and more authentic. If we want our students to develop that same lasting connection, we must be willing to guide them through a relationship that includes both pride and questions, both beauty and challenge, just like every meaningful relationship in our lives. Our kids and your kids are already seeing this on social media. Even 4th and 5th grade students, many of whom don't have their own phones yet, but are still being exposed through their friends' devices, older siblings, unfiltered group chats, adult conversations in the home, and constant background news coverage. The exposure starts far earlier than we often realize. Children are absorbing images, language, and narratives long before they have the tools to process them. This is why our proposal begins in the elementary grades, because that is where the questions, the confusion, and the early shaping of identity and understanding truly start. So these are some statistics from Federation's 2024 population study. 79% of Miami Jewish adults are very concerned about anti-Semitism on college campuses. 45% of Miami Jewish adults are very concerned about anti-Semitism in Miami. And 41%, which is an incredible number, of K through 12 Jewish students in Miami were enrolled in Jewish day school or yeshiva. We have an incredible advantage in Miami. An unusually large percentage of our Jewish children attend day schools and yeshivot. This is a gift not many communities have, and it's exactly why Miami is the ideal place to pilot this initiative. While anti-Semitism in Miami remains relatively low compared to other parts of the country, we at CAJE cannot wait for a crisis to unfold. Our responsibility is to be proactive and not reactive. This is precisely why CAJE was created. We are uniquely positioned to monitor the educational landscape, anticipate challenges, and support our schools before problems escalate. We also know that eventually our students will leave Miami to college, to new cities, to new environments, and we must prepare them now. These are all our participating schools that are part of the Certificate in Israel Education. You can see that each school is represented by a team that includes their head of schools, their board chairs, a senior administrator. The key is that the layperson or the board member is someone with significant credibility and influence in the community, someone who can speak confidently and address the difficult questions that may arise. Altogether, these 7 schools really represent a broad cross-section of our funded schools. It's more than half of them, actually, which ensures strong leadership, diverse perspectives, and of course, communal backing. So I want to end this with I'm not looking for everybody to answer these questions out loud, but rather read these questions and take a moment to reflect on these questions for yourselves. And as we've all experienced since October 7th, even our own perspectives have shifted. We're adults with years of maturity, life experience, and knowledge, and we are still struggling to process everything. Now imagine what this means for our students, who are still forming their identities, and for our teachers, who are doing their best to educate while navigating their own emotions and uncertainties. If this moment is complex for us, it is infinitely more complex for them. That's exactly why CAJE is stepping in so proactively. We are not waiting for crises to overwhelm our schools. We are equipping our educators, supporting our leaders, and ensuring that every student in our community receives thoughtful, nuanced, and compassionate Israel education. This is the work that strengthens our schools, our students, and our collective future. And CAJE is very proud to lead it. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer. Let me just get out of the presentation and stop sharing.
I'm sorry, I have an unrelated question. Helen, do you mind muting yourself?
I'm sorry. Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you. That was a wonderful.
I'm sorry.
Great presentation, Audrey. Thank you.
Thank
How
you.
does it look in the practice? Can you give us a little bit of how does it look? The 7 schools meet. Give us the
That's
big
a good
picture.
question. Yes, thank you. So we already met once via Zoom with Dr. Keren Fraiman as an introductory session. The teams of each school have committed to 2 3-day in-person seminars with Dr. Keren Fraiman in Miami. This will happen end of February and end of March. And there will also be a couple of online sessions in between. So when they all are meeting in person, everyone will be together, of course. That is the point, I think, to discuss all together and to sort of come up with a community-wide approach to Israel education.
Becky?
Yes, Becky.
When do you think that you'll implement the first phase of the program in the schools?
So phase 1 is really going to be with heads of school and, like I said, and lay leaders. Phase 2 will happen next year with educators, where we are going to train the educators on how to enhance their Israel education curriculum with some complexity and some honesty.
Is there anything being done before in order to address the angst and the quandary that the students and the teachers are dealing with now?
Yes, I think maybe having the heads of school, the board chairs, and the lay leaders come together will create some sort of cohesiveness in their mission around Israel education. And I think that needs to start from there in order for the educators to feel safe to start something in the classrooms.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Audrey, that was fantastic.
Thank you.
It's amazing that right after October 7th, when kind of polling our schools, most educators said they didn't really need a lot of Israel education brought forth. I think there was a hope in the beginning that things would just go back to normal really quickly, including in the education world. And
Right.
it's clearly that has changed over time. And this is happening in Miami thanks to you and your relationship with the Spertus Institute and how far you've come as a professional, especially over the last few years. And we're so blessed to have you doing this. And I couldn't be more excited to have you as part of our team. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
So now we have the privilege of learning from one of the leaders in the field of Israel research and education, Dr. Keren Fraiman. Dr. Fraiman is a professor of Israel Studies and the vice president and chief academic officer of Spertus Institute, a Chicago-based center for higher Jewish education, offering online blended master's, doctoral, and certificate programs in Jewish studies and leadership, focusing on applying Jewish wisdom for modern impact and aiming to empower leaders and strengthen Jewish life. She previously served as Director of Research and Evaluation at the I Center for Israel Education, where she continues to serve on the faculty of the I Fellows Master's Concentration in Israel Education. In March 2025, Dr. Fraiman was awarded the 2025 Ilya Salita Excellence in Applied Research Award in recognition of her groundbreaking work on conflict education within Jewish educational settings. This prestigious honor, awarded by the Jewish Funders Network, recognized scholars whose research has had a meaningful impact on Jewish communities worldwide. In January 2020, Dr. Fraiman was selected for the prestigious Wexner Fields Fellowship presented by the Wexner Foundation in partnership with the Jim Joseph Foundation. She received her PhD in International Relations and Security Studies from MIT and her BA in Political Science and Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from the University of Chicago. Her work has been supported by the U.S. Institute of Peace, the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism, and the Chicago Project on Security and Terrorism. A former Schusterman Israel scholar, Dr. Fraiman has worked at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis, served as an officer in the IDF, and led trips to Israel as a facilitator for both Encounter and Birthright Israel. Her chapter, Barriers to Entry, Exploring Educator Reticence for Engaging with the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict from Teaching Israel, Studies of Pedagogy from the Field, edited by Sivan Zakai and Matt Reingold, published by Brandeis University Press in 2024, aptly describes some of the resistance to teaching Israel with nuance and complexity here in Miami. Dr. Fraiman, we are thrilled to welcome you to address the Sage Board today.
Perfect. Thank you, Mark. It's really great to see you. So I want to first start by thanking you all for inviting me to join this board meeting, and more importantly, for being such courageous leaders in this space. And I start with that because I think entering the space that Audrey mentioned so eloquently is really an act of leadership. And in a certain way, that's really where Spertus Institute and our theory of change really stems from, and also what the research in the chapter really underlined in ways that I think have been surprising but consistently validated, not only before October 7th, but since then. And I think being the first really national program that takes a multi-stakeholder approach to exploring the space of Israel and what nuanced and complex Israel education can look like is really an act of courage. And I just want to commend you all really to start with that, because I do not take it for granted. Audrey is one of my most favorite alumni, but not the only alum on this call. Sorry up front. But just say that, Audrey and I, and, Mark, you had mentioned Audrey's growth as a professional. I'll share that I also witnessed Audrey's significant growth as a student in our program in the Executive MA in Jewish Professional Studies, one of the many offerings. And in fact, in a certain way, with Audrey's permission, I'll share the story of, some of where this came from. One of the really wonderful things about Spertus, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with Spertus, is that it really is a non-denominational institution, really committed to bringing people across difference for deep academic learning. It's an institution of higher education that's community focused. So we're really looking to use applied Jewish learning to address contemporary challenges. And that guides all of the learning at Spertus, but especially the learning that we do about Israel. And I teach the graduate course on Israel. And a few weeks before the course started, I had 2 emails in my inbox. One from Audrey and one from another student who was the executive director of a reconstructionist synagogue on the East Coast. And Audrey said, I'd like to have a call with you. And I said, okay, no problem. So we jumped on a call, and Audrey said, I'm really concerned about this other student. I have a lot of anxiety about entering into this conversation. I said, Audrey, I've been at this a long time. And then I talked to Sarah, and Sarah said, hey, I have a little bit of a concern about Audrey. And I said, Sarah, it's going to be fine. Like, we've been at it a long time. At the end of the course, I asked the students to have an applied project. And what I'll share is that at the end of the course, Sarah, my friend from the Reconstructionist Synagogue, went back to her synagogue to teach a course about Zionism, because it was the first time that she had understood that she was part of the conversation as opposed to outside of it. And Audrey came back and said, we need this in Miami. We need more nuanced Israel education among our students. And it's not because they're not committed to Israel, it's because they are committed to Israel. Right? Because they are committed to Israel, we need to support them and give them sort of the nuance and the opportunities for complexity. I want to share a little bit maybe about, introduce myself in maybe a funny way, because Mark, it's always funny to hear, I need to thank my mom for writing my bio kind of situation. But I want to share something that's not in my bio, which is that some of you may wonder how someone who's gotten a doctorate in security studies is now squarely in the educational world. And I'll share that it's a very personal story that I often share because it really, I think, highlights where my passion lies and also why I think this is so critical. I want to take us back to 2014. My now 18-year-old son was 7 at the time, and I was driving back from the Lincoln Park Zoo Camp, which is a camp in Chicago. And from the very back of the van, he said, Mom, I have a question. And I was like, Gotti, like, what's up? And he said, Mom, why did the Israelis kill 4 boys on the beach? And for those of you who remember, that was one of the very hard headlines of the 2014 Gaza war. And so like any good mom, I said, Gotti, do you want ice cream? And so we pulled over to a local ice cream shop and had a conversation about the conflict. And what I'll share is that I study security, I study terrorism. Like, that's really the core of all of my research at the time. And even though in a certain way, like, I knew the answer. Right? I knew that there was an investigation. I knew that Israel was doing what it could to understand what had happened, that it was a mistake. I also knew that in that moment, I was holding his Jewish identity in my palm. And so I didn't suddenly realize that it wasn't so easy to have this conversation. And if I was struggling to have this conversation, and I'm in it every day, it made me wonder about how Jewish educational institutions were struggling with these same kinds of questions that pop up, according to the research, as early as age 7. Right? Sivan Zakai, who's a wonderful researcher out in California at HUC, learned in her research that by the age of 7, kids are keenly aware of aspects of the conflict. The minute that they are reading, not to decode, but reading, they'll see the CNN scroll at the restaurant that you happen to be at. They'll listen to NPR, right? Suddenly when it happens to be, or whatever news channel you have on your TV. They'll look over their sibling's phone. They'll watch the newspaper that gets delivered. And they're trying to make sense of this. I'll share that I shared with him at his bar mitzvah that his question changed my career, and he doesn't remember that day because in my house, it's a Tuesday, right? Like, it's every day is like this. And I'll fast forward and say that if I thought that this was an old problem, it's even more acute now. In 2023, in November, I was part of an educational leadership mission to Israel. It was one of the first that had gone after October 7th. And my daughter, who was 13 at the time, was really upset by this decision. Now, my daughter, at the time, I thought only understood Sephora and TikTok. It turns out that it wasn't the case. And she said to me, Mom, you can't go to Israel. I'm going to hide all the clothes and your suitcase, all the suitcases. And I was like, I love fantastical thinking. Like, I love that I can hold on to that. But my little guy, who's 10, now, but was 8 at the time, said to her, Denise, where Mom is going, it's safe. She's not going to the South. And so Denise said back, well, Mom, you wouldn't go to Ukraine now. And so Gadi, my eldest, who was 17 at the time, said, well, Ukraine is more of an all-out conflict. All the major cities are impacted. And there's, it's really a totally different ballgame. To which my little guy then retorted, and anyways, Ukraine is a small country. To which I wrote the day school and said, Dear Chicago Jewish Day School, please focus on geography. But what it highlighted to me was that they all had a stake in it. They all were engaged with it in different ways. They had a lot of feelings about it. And they didn't necessarily have a space to explore it. And it's coming really early, right? I think there was a time when in Israel education, we feared about opening the Pandora's box. I want to just suggest the Pandora's box has long been opened. And even more importantly, I think sometimes we used to worry in Israel education about them encountering lies. And what I want to suggest is that it's harder to encounter truth, right? It's not to say that there aren't lies, and it's not to say that there's not anti-Semitism, and it's not to say that there aren't distortions. But Israel is complicated and it's hard and it's a state and it makes decisions and there are debates and discussions. I often joke that if we want to understand the most criticism of Israel, we should read the Israeli Jewish newspapers, right? Because that's where we'll find it, and that the range of opinions are real and alive, which is one of the blessings of having a democratic country. But that in a certain sense, when we flatten, as Audrey had so beautifully placed it, into sort of this infatuation, we miss an authentic relationship. And it's not loving despite, it's loving because and with, right? And those are things that I think exist when we open up the space for complicated education. Now, why did we take this particular approach, and what is the theory of change here? All of the educators in my study, it's always fun to hear someone else present your research. So thank you, Audrey. It was like actually a treat for me to hear it because I don't often get that opportunity. As they say, Mikol melamdai hiskalti, from all of my learners I have learned. So I loved hearing you talk about it. But what I'll say is that, you know, all the educators that I interviewed listed some of those aspects: knowledge, pedagogy, and emotions as things that got in their way. But 100% of the educators talked about the systems. And what that meant was that even those educators who felt pretty confident in their knowledge felt like they knew how to have difficult conversations, knew how to manage emotions, if they didn't feel that they were landing in institutions that had articulated their values, that sort of had their back. By the way, those were the words. Who will have my back when I get that phone call? By the way, that phone call exists on the right of politics, on the left of politics, in between. It's a donor, it's a parent, it's another faculty member. They were iced in their tracks. And oftentimes, I think, even though we can have schools that have very clear ideas about their vision for Israel education, they haven't had the opportunity for themselves as leaders to align themselves from the board to the person that's responsible for implementing that and really thinking through, like, what are the implications? What are the boundaries? I often say that clarity is kindness, but we often, you know, leave it at sort of the platitude level, right? Like Israel's an integral part of Jewish identity. We can agree to that, but what does that mean, right? What are we willing to talk about? How are we going to talk about it? What's going to be included? How diverse are the narratives? The other piece is that these are like significant leadership skills that actually extend beyond the Israel conversation, but are especially acutely needed in the Israel conversation. So, for example, how do we bring along diverse constituents? How do we communicate our vision in ways that allow people to understand what we're thinking about, but also why it's important? What are we going to do? What is our action plan when we get that phone call? By the way, I had educators who told me that in some schools, the principal will just take that phone call. The educator is relieved of that because the head of school and the educator are so aligned that they're not worried. And one of the things that I'll say is that I think sometimes we think that the phone calls come because a mistake was made. And I don't want to suggest that educators don't make mistakes. I make mistakes all the time. But this work is messy when we get it perfectly right. It's messy by design, right? It's complicated by design, which means that in a certain way, sometimes I joke that if I get a phone call from the right and the left, I've done my job, right? And my students, and Audrey can attest to this, don't know my politics by the end of it, because my job is to balance and bring different perspectives. And I think that part of the importance, or part of the challenge here, is how do we get leadership that then feel empowered, a head of school that feels like the board chair has their back, and an educator that feels that the whole chain has clarity around what they want to do and understand the importance, but then also support the implementation, right? And that's going to mean encountering narratives that don't feel familiar, encountering perhaps ideas that challenge your own notions. But as Audrey so aptly put it, the research doesn't suggest that that's going to challenge our politics. It's not even necessarily going to change. It's definitely not going to change our politics, and it's not going to necessarily challenge our connection. I think our deepest connections are those that are authentic and deeply rooted and can hold the complexity, right? I often joke that everyone says they want to hold multiple narratives, but it's a little bit like Seinfeld said, like anyone can take a reservation, but can you hold a reservation? We're working on the holding the reservation, right? Like really getting the skills to be able to hold that complexity in really authentic ways. And I think the last thing maybe I'll say on this front is that this is really hard work, and part of the real benefit of doing a cohort in Miami, the way that really Audrey and Efrat have worked together to bring into the space, is that it's sometimes really lonely to be in the space, and this is not going to prevent those phone calls. It's just going to give tools and skills for how to handle it. And so having a network of peers and colleagues who have a shared language, not necessarily shared outcomes, by the way, but have a shared language around how they're thinking about it, a trusted colleague that I can call and say, this is what came up, a place where they can share resources and think about how they've approached difficult questions, is really important. There was a moment when we thought about doing this together with the educators, right? To do first a leadership track and an educator track at the same time. And I think what we realized together was at first leadership really needed to feel supported and grounded in this work. And then we could bring the educators in different ways. And I think the thing that I'll just say is like our kids are going to have these conversations on the playground, right? It's sort of a whether we like it or not. And I think our responsibility as educators is to give them the skills and tools and the opportunity to contextualize these challenging questions that they're going to face within the safety of the spaces that represent their values, where they have trusted educators and friends and peers, where, by the way, they can have opinions and then change them, where they don't have to feel dogmatic about the ways that they think, where they can explore freely and raise doubts. Right. One of my favorite poems, which was probably going to be the kickoff poem, is a poem by Amichai called The Place Where We Are Right. And he talks about doubts and loves dig up the world, right? And so this idea that you can have doubt and love together, and actually giving our students an opportunity to be more comfortable with discomfort, right? To have the grit and the resilience to sit in uncomfortable spaces and still feel that their identities are secure. And their identities are secure not because Israel is perfect, but because Israel means something really deep for them, even when it's imperfect, right? And that imperfection, by the way, in their perspectives, will manifest in lots of different ways, right? Like what I think is a challenge in Israel might be different than what Audrey thinks, and that's fine. But it's authentic in both ways. And there are going to be things I'm going to really love and things I'm going to feel really challenged by. And that doesn't diminish my commitment to Israel. And the more that we can actually sit with that, the more it doesn't feel like the first time I encounter something that's challenging to me, my only choice is to double down or to exit. Right? To me, the fear is that that's what we're presenting our learners. Double down, right? Support everything, or exit. And that's a false binary. Right? It's a false binary in their world. It's a false binary with regards to Israel. Instead, I want them to think that their continued engagement, their continued connection, their continued relationship can be strong, and hopefully actually empowers them to work towards a better tomorrow, which is, I think, what we want our learners to be doing more generally. And to do that within the Israel space, I think, is really ultimately one of the big outcomes of creating a space for nuanced and complex and authentic and real Israel education, where the first time that they encounter these hard things are within our walls, not outside our walls. So I'll pause here for questions.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Talking about Israel education, a traditional Jewish education historically has really not had a focus on Israel education. It's always been more supplementary or complementary to a traditional Jewish education. Clearly, we're trying to not have that anymore. We're trying to bring Israel education as infuse it within all of our Jewish education. But where do you see it land exactly? Because keeping in mind that the ultimate goal is to build strong Jews, right? Knowing that Israel is this hot topic, and for some perhaps even a depressing topic, where do we place Israel education within the whole world of Jewish education so that we can ensure that every Jew connects to their Judaism as much as possible?
Great. So it's a really wonderful question. I'll just say a source of much debate. I'll just share that I'm currently sitting at the Foundation for Jewish Camp at a think tank about Israel education. And there was a question about why in their missions, in their new strategic plan, they have Israel called out separately from Jewish education. Okay, so this is, I think, part of an ongoing conversation around Israel. I want to give sort of both the philosophical and the practical answer to your question, because I think it's really at the core of a lot of things. The philosophical one is that I think Israel has always been an integral part of Jewish education, right, or at least of Jewish identity. And I think we struggled with the fact that Israel wasn't just this let's say, mythical Israel of ancient times, right? A Torah Israel, right? The Eretz Israel, but that it was actually like a political being, right? And we didn't know how to square the circle, right? Between something that's sort of ideological and pure and something that is real and messy, right? It's in a certain way, like the Jerusalem of the heavens and the Jerusalem of the earth, right? And so part of what I think happened was that it was sort of cast to the side, right? Like we had no problem talking about Israel in our prayers, or Israel as sort of camels and hummus or whatever, however problematic those images are, but also, and maybe appropriating, right? But like also, we didn't have a set of skills, because I think Jewish education by and large viewed itself as sort of apolitical. But what I want to say is all education is political, all education is subversive in a certain way. And part of, I think, one of the realities is that if we think that Israel is an integral part of Jewish identity, it has to be the all of Israel, both the heavenly Israel and the real sort of Israel of the earth, that includes the fact that it's a state and that it makes political decisions and that its people are diverse and have different opinions, some of which we agree with and many of which we don't. Like, it has to include all of that. So that's sort of my philosophical question. The post-October 7th answer is a real practical answer. And I think here there's sort of part of what Audrey had presented, but I want to add yet another layer. If you looked at the writings about Israel education in September of 2023, the big worry was that North American Jews were creating a reality, and this I think might not have been exactly true in Miami, by the way, because I think Miami is a little bit different, but that many North American Jews were creating a Jewish identity that was devoid of Israel, that Israel was too complicated, and so they were opting out of the conversation. The real fear was apathy and disengagement. It was hard to fill birthright buses, right? Like it would there were like a whole recruitment branch to try to get those birthright trips filled, because it was not taken for granted that even when something is presented to you as free, you were going to get on that bus, right? The complexity of Israel was having young Jews that were sort of divorcing themselves or saying, I don't need that as a central part of my identity. I think post October 7th, the way that I would represent it is that North American Jews, young and not young alike, I think, are all connected to Israel in their Jewish experience. And what I would add is, whether they like it or not. Okay. And I think that the jury is out about what that means for Jewish identity in North America, right? Because we're still in it in a certain way, right? And so I think part of the opportunity of Jewish education is actually to not, and I'll say to not just look past all the complexity of the last 2 years, now that like we still have one more hostage, but we feel like we're in a new page, not to say, oh, that was then, right? And to say, oh, let's go back to hummus and falafel, but to recognize that like this connection, it's sort of interlinking of the North American Jewish experience with what happens on the other side of the pond is something that is real and lived for young Jews, right? It's in their social, it's in their TikTok, it's in what they see on the streets. It's all the things. And that is the practical reality that for me, the Jewish educational opportunity is to say, we know this now, and now we need to help them process it, right? We need to help them understand what this means. The thing that I'll just add is that I think when is the worst time to study about the hard things? In the middle of the crisis, right? And in a certain way, if we had this conversation 6 months ago, everyone would have said it's super important, but it's actually almost impossible, because when we are in the amygdala space of the conflict, we don't have the frontal cortex part, right? Like these are two complications that we have. What I'll say is that I think in the past, and I often make this joke, so I'm sorry for those who've heard it before, is that in the past, I think Jewish educators literally held their breath through the conflict. When a conflict would spark up, they'd hold their breath, hope that it passed quickly so that they could move on to other things. What's the best time for a conflict? May and August, right? May, you're busy with graduation. You don't want to mess that up. August, it's like after camp ends and before school starts. And fortunately, the Israeli government has really been compliant with our academic calendar. By and large, May and August, they're really bad months. 2 years of conflict meant that educators could no longer hold their breaths, right? And that's where we are today. What I'm hoping is that over the next year, when maybe not every headline will be about Israel, that we will not forget what we felt for those 2 years, because the lack of preparedness of our learners and our educators after October 7th, I'm not saying there'll be another one. I don't know what there'll be, but what's clear is that this isn't over, and this is the historical anchor of our learners, right? if we went around here and asked, like, what's your historical anchor? My historical anchor is the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. I remember exactly where I was. I know that it changed my life. I know that it changed my worldview in many different ways. For our young learners, and when I say young, I mean 7 to age, 30, this is their historical anchor. And we need to process that and continue to understand that these questions aren't over, even if the active conflict has ended. And so both philosophically and I think practically, that's why Israel has to be there, right? Because it is both, I think, philosophically important, right, from an identity perspective, but it's part of their lived reality in ways that didn't exist in a pre-October 7th world.
Thank you.
So I
Any
think,
other questions? Oh, I see
yeah,
some.
Adrian and Chandra both. So Adrian first, I think, and then Chandra was right after.
Thank you so much, and congratulations on this important initiative. I have a concern, and I'm sure you've heard many, about the reality of the environment into which some of these college students and young people have to navigate. We have a family friend who is the president of a Hillel at a university that is not an enormously radical environment, shall we say. But she's in a totally not nuanced, hostile environment. The Hillel was not allowed to have an October 7th memorial. No faculty member had the courage to sponsor the event on campus. And the rhetoric that we're hearing is very troubling. Now, what I'm hoping happens here is number one, of course, the objective is that we have a proper understanding of history and not some kind of a fairy tale illusion. But on the other hand, we have to also understand the environment into which these kids are going, and them saying, oh yeah, Ben-Gvir is a terrible guy, is not going to get people to talk to them, to accept them. And in fact, the position of their opponents on campus is that they don't want to engage. They don't want to talk to us. So we can have all kinds of nuance among ourselves, but how are we going to have any traction and get our message across to other people? And again, I'm hugely supportive of what you're trying to do, and I see its importance, but maybe I'm reacting a little bit excessively to the fact that I see the angst and the pressure that these kids are under that actually have to operate under these conditions. So can you give us some thoughts
Sure.
on that?
Yeah, so I'll give you a couple of thoughts, some which might not be super satisfying. I'll say one of the outcomes that I'm not sure this initiative has is actually to create advocates. And there's been a long debate between sort of Israel education and advocacy. And I say that because I want to acknowledge that on some campuses, the environment is really difficult, and many students are feeling extremely challenged and anxious in those environments. And I'll just say that my work in this area also highlights that there are also spaces in which that we are holding nuance, including within classrooms and also within certain campuses. And both of these things are existing simultaneously. I say that because I think that part of the reason I started with what the goals aren't is because in a certain way, part of what I look for is for our learners to have a deep security in their own understanding. And there are people they're not going to be able to convince, right? And I think that by and large, one of the challenges that has happened in this moment is that there's a bell curve of kind of individuals. And on the extremes are the people that are sort of non-nuanced, one-dimensional, perhaps overly activist, right? But there's a whole other world of people that don't fit that bill. If I have an 18-year-old who's about to head out to college, my suggestion to him is I'm not sure that's where you want to spend your time, right? Like with the people that are yelling or having non-nuanced conversations, there's a whole world of people who have curiosity and to lead with curiosity and finding the spaces in which you can speak across difference. What I think that this program will do is give them the power to do that also, right? Because I think one of the challenges of the Disney World, and I feel funny saying that in a Florida crowd, but the Disney World version of Israeli history is that it actually doesn't let them understand how to say, well, what about Ben-Gvir? Or what about different things that they're seeing in the news? And their job isn't necessarily to process all the news, but it is the opportunity to be able to sit and hear opinions that are different from their own in a way that doesn't feel like it is identity crushing, right? And so for me, there's a whole other question of like, how do we deal with the rhetoric on campus and sort of the more extreme sort of one-dimensional views. And then there's the question of like, by the way, the heat on campus already from last year to this year has gone down. I suspect next year it'll go down even more. But this real issue around what happens the first time they enter a course, by the way, taught by an Israeli faculty that deals with the, Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and they learn all these things that they've never heard, right? I'm not talking about a faculty that misbehaves or only represents one view, that represents actually diversity. How do we position themselves to be able to hold that in ways that allow them to process that difference? Now, that doesn't mean, I don't want to underscore that the university campus is difficult. By the way, many of our learners, and I'll share that I learned this in working with some teens, don't even know for themselves why what these inflammatory statements mean, right? Or where that position is coming from. Not that it validates it or justifies it, but they themselves haven't had the chance to really understand it, which I think is a disservice to them, right? Because then it feels far, far more threatening. So it's not a full answer to your question, but I think my hope is that actually when they lead with curiosity and questions as opposed to exclamation marks, because I think for a long time we wanted to present our students with the exclamation mark view. Get out there. By the way, when I was in high school, this was the answer. What should you say? If they say this, you say that. If they say this, you say it. Didn't go anywhere, right? And by the way, then suddenly we learned something a little that didn't fit the exclamation, where like, I can't really exactly say the thing they taught me that I was supposed to say. And so to me, like that, being able to be confident, knowing that there's a variety of opinions, by the way, outside of the fringes, right, I think is actually very empowering. And I think that's my hope. Is Audrey knows this from my teaching. I say to them at the start, I always say at the start of class, like, I actually don't care what anyone's politics are. They're all welcome within my classroom. And I'm not looking to change your politics. I want you to understand your politics. I want you to understand the cost of the perspectives that you hold, right? You want to this, then what does it mean? You want to that? What does it mean? What does it cost? What are you giving up? What are the values that are in tension? Which one are you leading with? Like, those are the questions that I understand. And why might someone have a different opinion? And why is that valid as opposed to illegitimate? There are illegitimate positions out there that are anti-Semitic. I'm not talking about those, but there's a whole much bigger tent than what we typically engage with.
Thank you for the very thoughtful reply. And I know it's a big task ahead, and I appreciate that you're taking it on, because I just raised one of the difficulties, but I'm glad you give it that kind of insight and you look into it. So Hatzlacha Rabba.
No, thank you. I appreciate your question very much. And I appreciate the vulnerability of asking the thing that I think we're all thinking about, right? Which is there's a big tension and fear of letting our kids into a world which doesn't feel as friendly to Jews right now. And
when you see a 20-year-old girl tormented and really was very sweet and very loving and has a very ecumenical outlook and is not a hater and is a, and you see that they don't even have a chance to express themselves and they're mistreated, it kind of knocks the reason out from your brain. But we have to do what we can do, and I appreciate you doing your part. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we're going to take one more question from Chandra, and then we're going to move on.
That's okay. My questions have been answered.
Okay, then Barbara, you got the last question.
Yes, it's just a concern. Hi, Dr. Fraiman. I was fortunate to learn from you. And we had it's not an issue, but we had a parent there who voiced their concern that, oh my God, how am I supposed to go with this now? Because as I understand, this phase 1 and phase 2 is the systematic shift in how Miami-Dade schools, approaching Israel education. What do we do with the parents who are really opposing this shift?
Great. It's an excellent question. And it's exactly why we separated phase 1 and phase 2. Because I think one of the focus of the initiative is that we're going to give this leadership an opportunity to think about how do they bring constituents along. I think that parent education, and you and I had the privilege really of learning together in the morning after the teen sessions. To me, actually, that was not more valuable, but it was as valuable, maybe even more valuable than the work with the teens. Right. And so I think that each of these schools is going to have to, first off, better understand where their parents are at. And I think sometimes the opposition comes from fear, by the way. And fear is a particular emotion that it could even be rooted to Adrian's question in realities that exist. But sometimes the question is, okay, so if we have a fear, can we name the fear? Right. So is it the fear that if we engage in this complex education, that our learners are going to, become anti-Zionist? I'm just going to go most extreme. Then there's research to say that that's not true. In fact, quite the opposite, right? And I think that actually bringing parents along is the only way it will work, right? First off, by the way, I think it's a proactive strategy for that phone call, right? But I think that in each school, they're going to have to figure out who their parents are. Now, will this please everybody? Probably not. But I think if there isn't a case to be made to the parents, it won't succeed. And I think each school is going to have to figure out what kind of parent education is required. By the way, there was another concern that was raised there, which was for many of these parents, this is assimilating new information into the Jewish education that they had, right? And so, for example, for many of them, it was the first time that they encountered a Palestinian narrative. And that was very challenging to them as parents. Well, I think schools should be thinking really hard about how do they give parents the opportunities to be learners in this space and to actually be able to have the experiences before their children do, right? And that's part of the strategy that we're going to be working on, because in every school's, there is not a one size fits all, but I think that each school really needs to take time to understand who their parent population is, what are the concerns that they're going to raise, how do they address those concerns before the change happens, right? And I think that it like hits the nail on the head. It's exactly at the core of the theory of change. By the way, the same is true for board education, right? Like I'm sitting here at a board meeting. We all love our boards, and our boards are diverse, and our boards often don't have the chance to learn together, right? And so, and to understand, and this is why this is such a gift that I was invited to join for me, right? Because I think it is an opportunity to bring people along. And I think each school is going to have a board conversation as well, right? That says, here's why we're doing this. And are we all marching 2 by 2 into this space, understanding why it's important, understanding what we're willing to do. And I just want to name one last thing, which is, I think one of the things that's really hard in education, especially learner-centered education, is that we can create real clear boundaries about what we want to talk about or not talk about, and learners are going to bring whatever they want into the classroom. Okay. And so when a learner sees something really upsetting on TikTok that's outside of the predefined boundaries, we need to have a strategy for what we do about it. Right. And shutting it down pushes students away. Right. And so part of what this is really thinking through these scenarios and saying, okay, what's going to happen? And parents is like one that demands underlining in a big way, because there are, constituents, they choose to sign their kids up for our schools. But they're not the only constituents. By the way, it's true for faculty members in Jewish studies who might not be doing Israel education or secular studies. They also need to know what's happening, because it's going to come into their classrooms, right? It's going to come in from the side, and they also need to be brought along. And so this is part of what I would consider like the key leadership skill, which is around bringing people along to change. And people resist change, right? Change is scary. And that's part of what we'll be working on.